Welcome, everyone. This is Rick Dockery, and this is the webinar on compensation trends and pitfalls. So we've got a lot to cover in this next hour. I will be sending you the PowerPoint. People have asked about that. I will be sending them to you after the presentation. We are recording this presentation, so you'll be able to access it also at the end of the session today. So if you have any questions, feel free to call me after the session or email me, and I will get back to you. We're going to be covering an awful lot of information. Most of it is federal that we're talking about. We have people sitting in today or listening in today from multiple states, so I can't really get into the specific state laws today. And we've got multiple industries here. We've got everybody from municipalities and public utilities to healthcare to technology to construction and manufacturing. It's across the board. So it should be, hopefully it'll be an interesting session for you, filled with an awful lot of information. If you have any technical difficulties when you're going in, there's a phone number at the bottom. That's my assistant. Feel free to call her during the session. Hopefully we have ironed out all those kinks beforehand. So let us begin. The fact of the matter is a lot of us are talking about compensation. I'm getting an awful lot of calls about compensation now, and most of it is because of the issue of recruitment and retention, the ability to hire people, the ability to hire people. I'm doing a number of compensation studies, and primarily because employers are having difficulty in this area. The whole old adage about employees are just glad to have a job is clearly dead because it's becoming an employee market. They have a lot of options out there. There are a lot of job availability out there, and we want to make sure that we are paying them fairly. We want your organizations to remain competitive. A lot of you may have fallen behind during these tight economic downturn. I know a lot of municipalities have indicated to me that they did because they had no dollars to pay employees, and now they're struggling because employees are having options to go elsewhere. So we'll be addressing those issues today, as well as a tremendous number of wage and hour issues that I'm getting. I have a human resource helpline. A number of you are clients of mine on that, and getting a lot of calls about those kinds of issues. So we're going to address those wage and hour issues, or at least some of them, today. You should have received a booklet from me which covered a lot of the Fair Labor Standards Act issues that we talked about, a number of wage and hour issues, and so I will be referencing that throughout the presentation. So let's get into the issues we're talking about. There are 5 trends that I want to talk about that I am seeing in my practice with my clients. First one is wage growth, and we'll talk about that in a second. That's pay raises. What do the pay raises look like? What are we projecting for 2016? Wage equity is, are we paying fairly our people internally, internal equity? Are we paying against the market, external equity? So those are issues that we want to talk about too. In violations, wage violations, huge settlements out there which we'll be talking about where people are committing wage and hour infractions, in many cases not even realizing it, particularly on the part of supervisors. So we'll talk about that in a minute too. I'm also seeing an awful lot of annual short-term incentives that go beyond the regular compensation, more private sector than public sector. I'm seeing a lot of discussion on the public utilities side around for payment of the general manager or the superintendent. A lot of discussion from boards on the municipal side, though not a lot of activity around that. So short-term incentives are in play. A lot of them might even be benefit changes, 457s as an example for not-for-profits. So those are the kinds of things that we're seeing happening out there. And the fifth one is, how do I create non-monetary rewards? 3% increases that we've been seeing of late is really not enough, a lot of money to incentivize, to motivate people, to differentiate between the average employee and the superstar employee. So that is an issue too. So we're seeing a lot of emphasis on those non-monetary issues such as career development, learning development, challenging work, educational assistance plans, those kinds of things. So those are the trends that I have been seeing out there, and I want to walk through some of them in a little more detail, or some of them, not all of them. Pay raises that have been happening in 2014, the average national pay increase was 2.5%. Now, particularly a lot of the municipalities out there were on wage freezes, didn't get that, but the average in the nation was 2.5%. This year, it has been 3%, and I'm seeing that pretty much in the wage studies that I have done for my clients. We've been recommending the 3% on average for many of them, and we're seeing the same thing projected out for 2016, another 3%. Now, what that means is on average, the aggregate amount. So individual top performers are getting higher amounts, and the number is about 4.6%, and I'm seeing that also with my clients, too. Most of my clients, incidentally, are in the Northeast. So that gives you an indication for that. But I am also seeing that higher dollar amounts are occurring in the Northeast, more of them in the Massachusetts, Boston area than I'm seeing in probably northern Maine. But nevertheless, higher increases are in the Northeast, and clearly for critical positions. Electrical engineers, line persons for my public power clients out there, they're seeing higher in dollar amounts in many cases. Nurses for my healthcare and assisted living, and everyone is paying more money for IT professionals. So wage growth is clearly occurring where it hadn't been in the past, but it is still being held down a little bit compared to years in the past, pre-recession numbers. But those are the dollar amounts. So as you're looking at your current compensation and figuring out what are you going to do for your budget stand-out, the 3% is a fair number to look at. In terms of wage equity, what I am seeing, too, is because more employers are now hiring, in hiring to hire effectively often means you're going to have to pay more money to get somebody to do a similar position. So that's driving wages up. What that does is when you're having somebody, particularly from the same kinds of position, wages coming up, is that compression is occurring. What that means is the higher dollar, a person making a higher dollar is coming in, and it's pushing down against the people who are making lesser amount, who are your internal employees. And therefore, the equity issue is at play. And you're creating employee relations problems, enforcing turnover. And so that's the number of reasons why more employers are looking at studying their compensation. So you need to understand what the market rates are. What is happening out in the marketplace for my positions, whether it's an electrical engineer, a line worker, or a town manager. Understanding of those rates is critically important to do that. And you've got to make sure you understand your marketplace. We'll get into that in a second. Employers want to remain competitive. So maintaining that parity is important. So what I am recommending to my employers is that they review their entire wage program at least every 2 years. If you haven't done it in a while, I strongly recommend you do it. Some barometers indicate where you're having problems, or if you're having turnover, if you're having difficulty recruiting, whether you're getting employees rumbling about the level of their wages. So when I get asked to do a wage study, and these are the recommendations I'm giving you, these are some of the elements of it. Again, it's important to review the wages every 2 years. Now I'm trying to move this slide. Here we go. Slide forward. Every 2 years. Take a good look at your job descriptions. A critical look at them to make sure that they accurately reflect what the job is. Not the incumbent. So the incumbent may have a master's degree, but the minimum requirement for the person in that job is an associate's degree, as an example. Make sure the job descriptions clearly reflect what people are doing. And unfortunately, job descriptions are something that just seem to collect dust. And so what I'd strongly recommend is that you put in a review process to make sure your job descriptions are accurately reflecting the jobs. Secondly, is take a strategic look at your compensation philosophy. So what do I mean by that? And I've had a lot of discussion with boards and trustees about compensation philosophy. And that is, where do you want to stand against the market? Your compensation philosophy will tell you, do you want to pay above the market? Do you want to pay at the market? Or do you want to pay below the market? Obviously, paying below the market is going to create recruitment and retention issues unless you have a very rich benefit package or other things that'll make it so that you're an attractive employer. Now, obviously, affordability is a factor. Most organizations say, let me pay at the market. Some say I want to pay above the market, or some say there are certain critical positions, electrical engineers as an example, or nurses as an example, that I need to pay above the market to be able to create, so that they have a philosophy which says I'm going to pay at market, but for certain critical positions in my organizations, I will pay above the market. And that's important as you're taking a look at the marketplace, when you're taking a look at wages. And it's important then to conduct external market surveys to see what's happening in the marketplace. Now, there's a couple of things I want to talk about external market surveys. First of all, you need to understand what is your market. It could be a geographic issue. It could be I attract people from just this area, or it could be just from this industry. There are a lot of factors to understand what your market is. So if you run, a small public utility, your market isn't going to be if Microsoft goes next door, unless you're competing with them for accounting clerks, as an example. So your markets are very interesting in that respect. So understand what is considered your market. I just did a compensation study for a municipality and worked with the boards and spent a considerable amount of time with them really deciding what was their market. When you do the survey, you also need to do multiple survey data. When I do studies for my clients, I use at least 3 different surveys for positions. Now, a number of you are Maine municipals in here, and you use the Maine Municipal Survey, which is a very good survey. And a number of you are public utilities in Massachusetts that are on the line, and you use the MEME survey, which is a good survey. But they're small in number, and so certain changes in an organization skews the results the following year. So make sure you use multiple survey data and not just depend on one survey piece. You need to regularly review your pay grades and your rate structures and your titles to make sure they are reflecting both your internal equity as well as your external. So understand the market value of your positions. Now, if you are a small organization, and most of you who are calling in or listening in here are small organizations, you have what we call a blended position. So your finance director may also be doing other things, could be handling your payables and receivables. And so it isn't just a pure finance director position. So when you're doing survey work, you can't be comparing titles. You have to be comparing the job duties, and that's a critical piece there. Regularly adjust your rates, both internally and externally, to ensure that you're competitive, and you want to make sure that you're paying your employees fairly, and also, here's the flip side, you're receiving value for your dollars. Those are the critical components that I would recommend you do to ensure that you are maintaining good market competitiveness when you move forward. So if you have questions about that, feel free to call me after the session, and I'll walk you through how a study should be done and some of the elements that you should include in there. I can't get into too much detail here simply because we have an awful lot to cover. What I want to also talk about is the proposed Department of Labor overtime rules. And this is coming down like a train, very fast, and it's catching a lot of employers off guard. And I want to make sure that you are ready for it when and if it occurs, because there's an if into here. The Department of Labor is proposing, and it is expected to go into place, to double the minimum threshold for an exempt worker. So I'm going to back way up because I haven't defined exempt workers yet, but I want to make sure you understand it. There are two kinds of workers in terms of pay under the Fair Labor Standards Act. This is the law that's governing all the wages that we're talking about today. And I'm not going to get too technical here or too legal. Fair Labor Standards Act basically says whether somebody is an exempt salaried worker, remember that, or whether is a non-exempt hourly worker. So many of you have both. You have exempt workers, usually you're executives, and they get paid a salary, $600 a week, $1,000 a week, whatever it is. And you have hourly workers, $10 an hour, non-exempt. All right. Under the law now, to determine if somebody is exempt, they have to make a minimum dollar amount to be exempt. So, and right now, and what that is $455 a week or $23,660, which you see in that third bullet point there. And that's what they have to make. So if they make under $23,660, they have to be paid on an hourly basis. They're non-exempt. Now, that doesn't mean if they're paid above that, they are automatically exempt, but they have to make at least that number. The law is going to change, or the proposal is to change it, and this does not take congressional action. This is going to be done by the Department of Labor to increase it to $50,440 or $970 a week. That simply means is this. If you have salaried workers right now, exempt salaried workers, those people who don't receive overtime, and they are making under that $50,000 range, they would become non-exempt workers, and you would have to pay them overtime. It's that simple. Means test, the test, how much you get paid, is going to go from $455 a week to $970 a week at a minimum. So if you look at your people and you say, I've got counselors, I've got supervisors who are making $45,000 a week, a year, $40,000 a week, or whatever, they would be hourly non-exempt when this rule goes through. And that's shocking. Now, I was talking to one of my clients who's actually on the line here listening in. They have well over 200 people that are going to be affected by this law that they're going to have to make some decisions on. So I'm going to walk you through some of the options of strategies you can put in play to address this. Again, the law has not passed. It is expected to be implemented in 2016. The last time I heard anything, they were projecting sometime in the first quarter of 2016. So here's what the impact is going to be. Your labor costs are likely to increase with this because a number of you will be paying overtime where you hadn't paid overtime before because the person wasn't eligible for overtime. Staffing levels could go up or down depending on how you address this because you could be moving to reduce hours or to hire others. So some staff will be reduced below 40 hours to avoid overtime, and more staff might have to be hired. In other words, you may have part-timers. And I'm going through the strategies in a minute. Scheduling issues are going to come into play. And here's another thing that we're not getting a lot of discussion about. A number of your benefit programs are tied to your exempt status or non-exempt status. So if you're an exempt employee, you may be eligible for greater benefits, more vacation, or something of that sort, or certain other benefits. Now all of a sudden you'll be a non-exempt worker and losing those things. So you're going to have to take a look at your benefit plans. And frankly, losing exempt status, all of a sudden somebody is now having to punch a clock, maybe not literally, but record their hours anyway, is going to create some employee relations issues. So we're going to have to take a look at what are how this law could potentially impact you, and you're going to have to build a strategy. So this is what you need to do now to prepare yourself. Identify all of your people who are salaried exempt people who are earning below $970 a week, or $50,444. Make a list of all those people. Then you got to decide whether you're going to bump them up to meet the new threshold. In other words, give them a new increase. So if they were making $870, you're going to give them a $100 a week increase to avoid having to pay overtime. Or are you going to just simply say they're now hourly non-exempt? Those that need to be reclassified, you got to understand how their hours work, etc., because they're going to be, if they're now non-exempt and they've normally been working 50 or 55 hours a week, they're going to be paid another 15 hours at time in 1/2. So those are some of the issues that you're going to have to decide on what you want to do. The other thing is you've got to determine an approach to setting new non-exempt rates, So you could simply take their salary and divide it by 40, and their weekly salary and divide it by 40, and that's their hourly rate. It's that simple. You can replicate the current pay in hours, such as by lowering their hourly rate to account for the possibility of overtime. So if they were making $800 a week in working 50 hours on average, you do that calculation to come up with a new hourly rate. Or you may just simply reduce their hours so they never work above 40 and never are eligible for overtime. So these are just some of the strategies that you may want to put into play to address this. Now, there's another classification for exempt workers, and those people are somebody who earns in excess of $100,000 is, with certain exceptions, which I'll talk about in a minute, are automatically exempt or can automatically be exempt. The number is expected to go up to about $122,000 for that highly compensated category. But again, everyone needs to be tested. Now, I'll be talking about the tests in a minute, but the test is in your booklet that you received. If you didn't receive the booklet, give me a call or send me an email, and I will resend it to you. So take a look at the testing of all your exempt positions to make sure they are exempt. That's the duties end of it. Take a look at them to make sure they meet the wage piece, and take a look at your benefits. Again, the proposed law is supposed to go into place sometime in 2016. You should be prepared for it now. Understand how it's going to impact you. Understand how it's going to impact your employees. Understand how it's going to impact budgeting and staffing, and put together a plan. I will keep all my clients abreast of the timing of the law changes. All of you should feel free to call me if you need help or questions on how to address that. But this change in the law is a critical piece, and that's why a number of you signed up for this webinar, so that you are prepared to deal with that issue. Now, we've been talking about what is known as the Fair Labor Standards Act. It's a law that went in place in 1938. It is federal. Each state has their own wage and hour law, but whichever is greater supersedes. We're just talking about the federal because there's so many of you from different states that are on the line. That's the law that talks about minimum wage, the Fair Labor Standards Act, and that's getting a lot of attention. Expect more of that in 2016, as a lot of people are talking about increasing the minimum wage. It was just on the ballot for those of you in Maine, in Portland. It's been in other areas. It's been that way throughout Massachusetts. We're seeing a lot of push to increase the minimum wage. The overtime issue is employees are eligible for overtime, non-exempt employees, for those hours they worked in excess of 40. That's different from what union contracts may say, that may indicate that individuals are eligible for overtime after 8, or for those of you in construction who are listening in, under the Davis-Bacon Act's mandates overtime over 8 hours. There's a discussion of child labor in this law, and what constitutes a work week. And that becomes a critical piece of defining your work week, to know where overtime puts into play. And for those of you who are in municipalities, we're going to be talking about different kinds of work weeks in a few minutes when we talk about fire and police. So let's move forward here. Here's some rules that you should understand. And that is, you may have an employee who says, I'm not worried about the overtime piece. You don't need to pay me that. And that does not free you. The Fair Labor Standards Act makes it quite clear that employees do not have the right to waive the law. Does not say that you don't have to comply with it because it doesn't really bother me whether I get paid overtime or not. Whether they want to or not, if they incur it, the law says if you suffer overtime, you must pay it. And that's an important piece. So let me just define this. Exempt versus non-exempt, salary versus hourly. And incidentally, for those of you who want, I have a YouTube video. It's about 4 minutes. If you go into YouTube and type in Rick Dackery, it'll pop up. It's a nice explanation in much more detail than I'm going to give you now about what constitutes exempt versus non-exempt, hourly versus salary. Exempt or a non-exempt worker must be paid overtime for all hours of 40. An exempt worker does not have to be paid overtime after 40. Exempt workers must pass the Department of Labor Fair Pay Test, which is in your booklet. An abbreviated version of it is in your booklet. And that's the important thing. You can have, traditionally, non-exempt means hourly, exempt means salary, but you can have a salaried non-exempt worker. That's usually an administrative person. Maybe your executive secretary who gets paid $500 a week if he or she works 10 hours or if she works 40 hours, gets that $500 a week. But if they're salaried non-exempt, if they work in excess of 40, they must be paid over. That's an exception to the rule, not an exception to the rule. That's a nuance of the rule that you should be aware of. But that's how we define exempt, non-exempt. And here's the details of it for that. There's a salary test to determine exempt status. As it currently stands, there is what they call a means test, which is how much you get paid. The minimum salary for an employee is now $455 per week, or $23,660. If they make less than that, they're automatically non-exempt, and they must be paid time and a half over 40. And employees with annual compensation over $100,000 are called highly compensated. Those folks are automatically exempt, can be treated as exempt. Frankly, anybody can be, the president of the organization can be paid on an hourly basis. But if you get paid in excess of $100,000, you qualify as an exempt worker, with some exceptions, which I'm going to show you in a minute. Those are what we call, as I said, the highly compensated. Now, it has to pass what we call the duties test. And this test is very complicated, and it needs to fall into certain categories, which I'll talk to you about now. Now, critical element of this is under the duties test is it doesn't matter if you get paid 10 hours or 60 hours. If you are an exempt worker, you must be paid whatever that salary is. Now, let's say it's $600 a week. So if you're a salaried exempt worker and you get paid $600 a week, every week you must get paid that $600. If you work 20 hours this week, you still have to get paid $600. So it's not based on the hours you worked. It's based on your job. So you cannot dock, some exceptions, an exempt worker's pay. I got to go to the dentist today. I'm leaving at noontime and I won't be back. You can't dock my pay. Now, you can do something like you can draw pay down out of their PTO, pay time out bank. That's okay. But for the most part, you cannot dock pay. And that's an important thing to do. If they are salaried exempt, if they're an hourly worker, they only get paid for their hours. So that's all that matters. So I hope that's clear. Now, you can make certain deductions. But as an example, you can, and this is all in your booklet. Here are some of the examples, not all of them. No deductions for an exempt worker can be made if somebody has jury duty or witness leave or military leave if the employee works during the work week. So if they come to work part of that week and they go in, I got to go to jury duty tomorrow, you cannot dock their pay and exempt. In the red booklet there, the red print there, it refers to the booklet that I have sent to all of you, and it goes into the detail. If you dock their pay, you potentially forfeit paying them as an exempt worker and make everyone in that job category, like all of your supervisors, non-exempt. It's Fair Labor Standards Act. It's complicated. I get more questions on this act, and it is the enforcement arm is frightening, which I'll tell you a little bit about in a minute. So, an employee can you pay an employee more than their salary if they're doing extra work or they're coming in on Saturdays and Sundays? Yes, you can. So that won't forfeit their status. Drawing money from paid time from earned leave is probably not going to be the case. Here's a point that people often call me about. I'm going to pay an employee $600 a week, but I just hired them, and they're starting on Tuesday. Do I have to pay them the $600 for the full week, even though they're only working 4/5 of it? And the answer is no. That's an exception. You could pay them, in that case, 4/5 because they didn't come in on Monday. They started on a Tuesday. Same case, they're quitting, and they're leaving on Thursday. Do I have to pay them the $600? No. In that case, you can pay them only 4/5. They're quitting, and they leave Friday afternoon at noon. Do I have to pay them the full amount? No, because they quit. And it's only for those exceptions that you can dock. Actually, you're not docking their pay, but you don't have to pay them the full amount. But again, if you are thinking of docking any salaried exempt person's pay, check the materials that I sent you or give me a call, or the bottom line is you probably should pay that amount. Docking exempt workers' pay is not allowed under the law in general. Certain exceptions, which we can get into, but I just wanted you to be aware of that. I hope that's clear. Hourly workers get paid for just the hours they work. Now, what happens if you find out you made a mistake? To avoid any liability, and the liability can be double or triple their hourly rate plus penalties if you make mistakes and charges are brought against you. To avoid it, the way to do that is to put in place what they call a safe harbor policy, which says that if you made a mistake, this is what you should do to correct the problem, and correct the problem. And as I'll say in a few minutes, the safe harbor policy, which prohibits improper pay deductions, and has a grievance if people feel that they are improperly paid. But it also, you should document what you're doing. So if you find out that somebody should have been paid for their break and because they worked through their lunch period and you didn't, and you become aware of it, you can correct the situation and document that you did it. Because what will happen is if somebody decides to file a complaint with the Department of Labor, they're going to come in and they're going to want to see a paper trail of what you did. So I recommend that you add a policy to your employee handbooks. And when I write employee handbooks, I always include a safe harbor policy in the handbook. So I've been talking about this duties test. Let me explain what it is. And again, it's outlined a little bit in your booklet. The Department of Labor has a nice outline of it. If you want some more information on it, I will be happy to send it to you. But in order to determine if somebody is a salaried exempt worker, they have to pass one of these 6 tests. One, the first test is an executive test, and it's pretty long and detailed, so you're not going to see it here in this webinar today. But what it basically is a test to determine whether the individual has discretion and independent judgment. So your CEO fits into there, your CFO fits into there. They need to supervise 2 or more full-time employees to qualify for the test. And they need to have hire and fire authority, either to be able to do it or strongly recommend it. If they only supervise one, that doesn't qualify them. So they have to pass this part of the test for an executive exemption. When employers, my clients call me and they say, can you run a test? I may run a test on all of these for one person, one position. So we'll take a look at that. There is a second test called an administrative test. And this is primarily for that office person who does primarily office work, but of a non-manual basis. In other words, they're not doing repetitive manual labor. Again, they must have discretion and independent judgment. Some of the categories may be your payroll manager or your human resource manager or your purchasing manager may fall into that administrative employee category. Your professional employees, there are two kinds of professional employees tests. They were called a learned and a creative professional. A learned professional could be your nurse, someone who requires extraordinary education beyond a high school diploma, a degree generally. That's why a registered nurse often falls into there. Or a creative professional. A learned professional could be also a teacher. Creative professional could be someone in your marketing department. The fourth test is what we call the computer employees, and that is the most complicated of all tests once you see it. And that's primarily your computer analyst. The person who sits at your helpline desk, often is not fall into that category. But the computer test is interesting in the sense that it's the only exempt position that you can pay an hourly rate, and the hourly rate is $27.63 an hour. And then we have the highly compensated. Now, a copy of the tests are in the white paper. But I would recommend that you test all of the positions. And if you've never done it before, at the risk of being self-serving, either send it to me to do the testing for you or have some professional do it. Don't try to figure it out yourself. It is pretty complicated. Every job, as I said, should be tested. And just because you call somebody a manager, as an example, don't assume they're exempt. It isn't based on the title. It's based on the duties. Now, one of the exceptions is the blue-collar exemption. I'm going to try to turn this. There it is the blue-collar worker test. And this was an exception put into place. The unions insisted on it, and the Department of Labor accepted it, which said it doesn't really matter. If they fall within the test of a blue-collar worker, they must be non-exempt and must be paid overtime. And it's usually the maintenance person who gets paid a lot of money, over $100,000 a year, because of the nature of what they do, an electrician as an example. But they get over $100,000, they still must be paid overtime. Now, there are some public safety exemptions because I got a number of municipalities on the line. I wanted to just quickly go over that. The overtime based on 40 the exception is police and fire don't necessarily do the 40-hour piece. They have an exemption for that. And it also can apply to paramedics, EMTs, who respond to fires and are considered fire protection. In this case, you have to take a look at the work week, and it could be anywhere from 7 to 28 days. And I'm not going to get into the test here, but what I recommend is those municipalities that are listening in, that either contact me or go to the Department of Labor website. It's dol.com, and then go on to Fair Pay Act. You get fact sheet number 7 and fact sheet number 8, which gets into how to pay law enforcement and fire protection and EMTs overtime, how the overtime calculation works. Incidentally, there are some state laws also that kick into play for this. The other thing, particularly for the municipalities, is a thing called compensating time, or compensatory time, or comp time. Anyone can have comp time if you are an exempt worker. If you are an employer who is in the private sector, non-exempt employees, the hourly employees, are not eligible for comp time. So you cannot give comp time if you are in the private sector to non-exempt workers. Hope that's clear. If you are a municipality, public sector municipality, then you are allowed to give compensatory time, which is basically, instead of paying you overtime, I'm going to give you time off in the next pay period in lieu of that overtime. You can do that, but there must be a mutual understanding, and there must be clearly defined in your handbook or in your union contract how that's going to be done. And there is a fact sheet on that also to help clarify that. Not all municipal employees are eligible for comp time, and that's why it's important for you to take a close look at that reg. Those are the two exceptions that I wanted to get into for municipalities. I haven't given a lot of detail on it. I'd be happy to do that offline. I want to move on for the other pieces of this. Non-compliance with the Fair Labor Standards Act for all this exempt that we're talking about and how we pay people is severe. Penalties of back pay, overtime pay that's missed, civil penalties up to $1,000, criminal prosecution if they determine that you knew it and failed to correct it, civil penalties for child labor violations of $10,000, and attorney fees. It is phenomenal, the cost to this. And there are lots and lots of lawsuits that we're seeing out there. And I'm going to get into them in another minute or two. But I'm telling you, don't take the Fair Labor Standards Act in your pay policies and how you pay your employees lightly. And I'm going to show you some horror stories in a minute. So my recommendations, and then I'll get into those horror stories, is take a look at all your exempt positions. Take a look at all your job descriptions. Review them to make sure they're properly classified. Those that are exempt are classified properly. And update your job descriptions. Develop a safe harbor policy and include them in your employee handbook. If you have any kind of compensation programs, commission programs, bonus plans, a number of you listening in have those kinds of plans. Make sure they're all in writing and they are detailed so you can defend them and also so your employees understand them. If you make a mistake, correct it and document what you have done. So you should have clear records that you've complied with the law. We all make mistakes. Make sure you have a safe harbor policy. Make sure you correct them. And if you have some questions, you're not sure what to do, call me, call my HR helpline, and I'll be able to help you with that. So the problems that I see fall into there. Here's where the pitfalls are of this. Compensable time cases, exemption cases, independent contractor cases, and I want to talk about that, and unequal pay. Here are where I see some of the issues that come into play frequently. And that is, we have more and more workers, these are the typical ones, who perform tasks before the start of work. Maybe the supervisor says to somebody, on the way into work, could you stop at the hardware store and pick up this product? Or could you do this or that? That is compensable time, and they should be paid for that. Individuals who work through lunch, or particularly nurses or for long-term care where all of a sudden there's an emergency and you can't not work, so they're working through lunch and are not paid. And oftentimes it's because you have electronic time clocks that lock you out, so it automatically deducts for that. Correct them. Or on-call time. You are outside of work and you're on call and not being paid. Or here's where we're seeing a lot of problems now in a lot of case law, and that is there's an expectation that your workers who have access, they may have company-issued iPads, iPhones, laptops, or they're expected to check in for email or calls off time and are not paid for that. Again, the Department of Labor says all work or any time suffered must be compensated. So take a look at your practices to make sure people are being compensated for the off-time work that they're doing. And make sure you train your supervisors so they understand it, because there's where you get into trouble. You may have policies against it, but your supervisors are not aware of it. So make sure they're involved with it. Otherwise, you're going to get yourself into a lot of trouble and without knowing it. Here's where you have that motivated worker, ones that you love and dear, who do all that work, who take work home because they want to get a project done, and say, don't worry about it, I don't need to be paid. Remember, you can't exempt yourself. Or you're not even aware of it, that they're working from home to get things done. They should be paid for the work they do. If you have people who come in and they punch in and they're just waiting around to be able to get assigned, they need to be paid for that. On-call people have to be paid if they are tethered. In other words, they can't go beyond a certain area. Oftentimes they have to be paid, and that's a tricky gray area. We should talk more about it. If they work through their breaks, so you don't have lunch breaks, they should be paid. Travel time. Some travel time requires pay, and there are exceptions where travel time doesn't. We talked about comp time, traveling to, and that's, again, for the private sector and public sector. Training time, compensated. In certain states have laws that also are stricter than the Fair Labor Standards Act. So take a look at those situations. There's where a lot of the troubles come. There's where a lot of the penalties come into play on pay practices. So this isn't an HR issue or a payroll issue. This is a management issue that needs to be addressed and looked into to make sure your practices reflect your policies. And ignorance of the law, so supervisors who are not aware of it, is not doesn't get you off the hook. Now, one of the other things is the misclassifications of those exempt workers or non-exempt workers, where you call them salaried and don't pay them. Again, they have to pass the test. And so that's what I recommend you do. When I do a comp study for my clients, we always test all the exempt positions. And so you should regularly review those exempt positions to make sure they are properly classified. Now, I'm talking about popularity here, and these wage and hour cases are popular for attorneys because oftentimes if you make wage and hour mistakes, for one, you've made it for many in your organization, and so they turn it into what they call a class action suit. They're getting large recoveries, and penalties are often double and triple the amount. So, plus attorney's fees. So the attorneys love these cases, and so I strongly recommend that you make sure your house is in order to do that. Let me just show you some settlements. These are huge settlements, and you're going to say, well, I'm not these large companies, and I'll tell you some small settlements. The 24-Hour Fitness USA had a $17.5 million claim. But basically what the claim was is that they forced workers to work off the clock. Roto-Rooter case, they failed to pay the minimum wage in overtime. So they had people working overtime while they didn't meet minimum wage, and they didn't pay them for it. The Puerto Rico Department of Corrections, again, failed to pay overtime. Now look at these settlements. Walmart. It's a huge settlement there, and they've been in the news for forcing people to work off the clock and forcing people to work through breaks. And Starbucks had an issue. We've got some restaurants listening in today. Violation of their tip pool. We're not even getting into tip pool issues today, but that's a violation. Now, you're thinking, well, those are huge companies. That's not going to apply to me. I have one of my clients listening in, which is a human service client, had a supervisor who was under a mandate of no overtime, and yet her employees were working overtime, and she knew it. And what she did is she adjusted the pay every week, the hours every week, so they weren't getting overtime. And the employees knew that. And finally, it was discovered. And so we went through meticulously time cards for a 2-year period to rectify that and calculated how much overtime was not paid and then made payback to those employees that exceeded 6 figures. So it doesn't take a huge corporation to make these kinds of violations to potentially run these kinds of risks. And so I encourage you to make sure you understand what your pay practices are in your organization. Now, many of you employ independent contractors, and I know a lot of you are from Maine and Massachusetts who are listening in, and each of your respective attorney generals have been clamping down on this independent contractor piece, so on a state level as well as a federal level. And that's why I point out that there are several tests that get into independent contractors. And so there are a lot of activity around contract computer programmers that you bring in, contract marketing and design people that you bring into the organization for certain projects, home health aides, on-site consultants who work at your facility, clinicians and counselors. There are a lot of activity around, are they independent contractors or are they, in essence, employees? So there are tests. There's tests for everything, as you're beginning to realize. There are tests to make sure you pass, and I recommend that you look at the IRS test if you have any independent contractors. Because what the penalties are back pay. The states are looking at it because you are not providing them unemployment and workers' compensation, and so you're being charged for that also in benefit violations. So make sure your independent contractors are bona fide independent contractors and not employees. So before you put anybody on as an independent contractor, I'll just pay them at a 1099. And a lot of employees or prospective employees or independent contractors prefer to be independent contractors because they command larger hourly rates. Make sure they pass the test. And again, if you have questions, give me a call on that. So here are some of the ways to figure it out. If the payer, that's you, have a right to control or direct the individual, then they are not an independent contractor. But if you basically say, I need this job done, and you do it any way you want, when you want it, with your tools, they probably are. Any earnings of a person who is an independent contractor, who are subject to self-employment tax. That's an important piece. The next thing, you're not an independent contractor, so that means you're an employee. If the employer controls what you do, when it's done, how it's done, etc. Even if you have a lot of freedom, if the employer controls it, then you are an employee. And that's an important piece to understand. And a lot of times, as harsh as it sounds, is you have independent contractors working for you, and you invite them to parties and employee meetings and things of that sort for informational purposes. You are now beginning to recognize them or treat them as an employee, and so you have to be careful about that. So the independent contractor issue is a issue that you should be focusing on, and if you have any, make sure they pass the test. I am not going to get into the test for unpaid student interns, but they need to pass a certain test too, otherwise they're eligible for pay. And what's happening on the independent contractors and even on the student interns is they are asking or saying I should be paid, and they're filing claims with the Department of Labor. And when the Department of Labor gets a claim that they decide to, and they investigate all of them, they're going to look at everything, not just the student intern and the independent contractor. They're going to be pulling your time cards. And for those of you who've experienced Department of Labor audit, you know what living hell is all about. Now, here's an issue that's been coming up of late is, can employees discuss their pay? And a lot of you have policies that said employees cannot discuss their pay. Well, the National Labor Relations Board has jumped in on this, even for those in non-union organizations, because you fall under the National Labor Relations Act, that are basically saying that employees have a right to discuss their pay amongst each other, because otherwise you are preventing concerted activity, and that's a violation. And what we're seeing is a lot of employees are discussing their pay on social media. And employers are trying to stop that, and it's becoming very difficult to do. So take a look at your policies around preventing employees from discussing pay. We're coming into the end of our session right now, and I'm going to make some final recommendations to you. First is audit your current compensation programs and pay philosophies at least every 2 years. It's very important to do that to make sure that you're competitive. Take a look at your job descriptions to make sure that they reflect the job. Conduct those internal and external market surveys, and again, use multiple survey data, at least 3. And take a look at your pay ranges and grades in how you administer, how somebody gets a pay increase, how somebody gets what happens if you promote somebody, what happens, frankly, if you demote somebody. Make sure you're consistent with your policies, whether you're unionized or not. Take a look at all your exempt positions to make sure they're properly classified, your non-exempt positions to make sure they're properly classified, and also your unpaid interns. And again, all the tests are on the Department of Labor. Call me if you need some help. Review your wage and hour policies. And make sure the policies reflect the practices, and make sure your supervisors understand the rules and their obligations on that. Again, that's where I find most of the problems occurring, is with the supervisors who are not familiar with it, particularly the no overtime enforcement policies that some of you have. Whether your supervisor or your CEO commits a violation, it's a violation. Develop a strategy for the potential of this new overtime requirement going into place. So identify what that is. And then if necessary, call me for any assistance you may have on that. I can help you with your pay practices, your comp systems, your training, or your compliance. We've covered an awful lot of information over the last 60 minutes. And again, if you have questions, feel free to call me on that. Because it's important that I hear that and I can help you with that. So feel free. Here is all my contact information there. Check that YouTube out on what constitutes exempt or non-exempt. I'd like your feedback, so send me an email or give me a call on that to make sure that I provided you the quality and the value that you wanted from that. After this session, I will send you this PowerPoint presentation, and once we get this recording done, we'll post it and you can go back and listen to it. So I want to thank you for your time. Good luck in reviewing it, and this will conclude our session for today. Thank you very much.